All right, well, we're out here on a somewhat rainy day with my 71 Granville, the first year of this body style. So it would run from 71 to 76, although the Granville will be dropped after just a few model years. It was introduced in 1971. And then I guess it just wasn't perceived as being overly successful and will be dropped in favor of the Bonneville Brougham toward the end of the run. But we're not here to talk about the Granville today. We're here to talk about a failed General Motors invention that's not on the front of the car, but it's actually, as we come to the back here. These deck lid louvers that appeared on pretty much every General Motors car for 1971. So what was going on here? Now, first of all, this flow-through ventilation system, Chevrolet called it the Astro ventilation system, was something that you could find on Thunderbirds and Ford cars, the Mark III, too. It would have these, like, basically louvers in this tulip panel ahead of the deck lid, and that would enable the in-cabin air to come out and basically exit the vehicle. So you could smoke inside the car and you didn't have to worry about the cigarette smoke just not going anywhere. It would actually go out the back of the car. And on these vehicles, the blower fan runs all the time, which is kind of good but also annoying. And that's to make sure that the cabin has a positive pressure and that it's actually pushing the air through the rear seat into the trunk area and then coming out these deck lid louvers. Now, this is a later 1971 car. You can tell because there's fewer louvers than what they started the year with. And if you look at some of the early 1971 Chevrolet ads, they even had more deck lid louvers in them. They just kept cutting them back and back over time, because they found that this setup just wasn't working all that well. And for 1972, they would move the system into the lock pillar there. That's where it would remain for many years, and to some degree still remains to this day. But you have these deck lid louvers that you can see here, and it's starting to rain wonderfully. How did that work? Well, like I said, the in-cabin air would pass through the rear seat, and then it would go into the trunk where it would come out of these vents. Let's take a look at the trunk and we can explain more in detail. All right, so here's the interior of the trunk on this Granville. It used to have a CB radio, but like I said, the air would kind of come in through the rear seat, come into the trunk, and then you have this foam padding here, which I think was in part for sound isolation and also just, well, for overall deadening. Because the upper portion, this trunk lid is two pieces, is exposed obviously to the outside. So the air would pass through here and then it would come out these deck lid vents. Now the problem was, you can imagine on a rainy day like today, you go through a car wash, the water goes in through here and it's in between the two pieces of the trunk. And it was supposed to come out these little flaps here and drain out onto the ground. There's one on either side. You can see they're perforated. This rubber, though, is pretty stiff. It's not overly pliable. Of course, this car's 50-some years old, so maybe that's part of the reason why. It's still flexible, but it would take quite a bit of water pressure to kind of make that move down and out of the way. In any case, the idea was that the water would get in there and then it would drain out through those drain holes here over top of the deck lid and then over top of the taillights, which created its own issue, as these panels often rotted out on these cars. But another problem with this was in the winter, if you went through a car wash, which yes, all the Midwesterners do because your car gets full of salt, even if it's below freezing, we all go through car washes here, and you'd get the water that came in here and it would freeze. It would make this deck lid super heavy and it wouldn't want to open. And then, of course, the water's draining out those holes, which would freeze, and the trunk would freeze solid. Wasn't a great setup. Then there was also some problems, some experience where the exhaust would potentially backdraft into those louvers. I don't know if that was common or not. As I said, the fan is running all the time on these to positively pressurize the cabin, but it kind of worked and it kind of didn't. In any case, I had to move inside here because it started raining. But GM vehicles would discontinue those louvers for 1972, except for the Vega. And the idea was basically just put to bed. It was a good idea in practice, but as you saw, imagine just having water coming through here and then basically helping rot out the trunk inside of it, because the water has to come in through here and then drain out in those holes that you saw that are over here. And in particular on these 71 Pontiacs with this taillight setup, the water would get behind the taillight and the rubber gasket and it would start rotting out this little panel back here. I remember when I first got this car, there were thankfully just a few little rust bubbles which I had taken care of. But I remember talking to somebody at a junkyard in Arizona. I said, "Do you have any of those panels?" I was just curious if they had some from a dry climb. He said, "No, they even rotted out down here." So something to look for if you're buying one of these 71 Pontiacs. Just make sure that this panel is in good shape. And as a consequence, I try not to get this wet. I don't drive this car on rainy days. And then if I'm washing it, I even keep the water away from it. This I had repaired, 12 years ago, and it still looks just fine. I've owned this car for a long time. So there you have it, the failed General Motors flow-through ventilation system on the 1971 full-size cars. Something that unfortunately would not be repeated again. And then afterward, I think pretty much all the car companies discontinued this type of setup. You didn't see it anymore. For instance, the Mark III had it, the Mark IV did not. And I suspect part of the issue was that, like the Rivieras, the Mark IIIs, the Tornados, they all had little tubes that were drainage tubes that would come down from the tulip panel and then basically let the water come out inside the fender well. And those tubes would rot, and then you would have water leaking into the trunk. So I think that the whole setup was just discontinued after a few years for that reason. And then you'd see on pretty much any car that they would put the ventilation exhaust basically in the lock pillar here, which was a much better setup outside of the elements and no issues associated with it in that case. By the way, if you have one of these 71 Pontiacs, I will say that these came standard with single exhausts. And one of the things I found, this has a 455 cubic inch V8. First year, the low compression engine, but it's pretty peppy still in this car. It has a relatively short rear end ratio, 308:1, which I would say is short for a 455 powered car. One of the great things though is if you put dual exhausts on this, which I have done, factory style duals, you end up getting about 35 horsepower out of your V8 engine that you otherwise didn't have just by putting dual exhausts on it. So if you want a cheap way to get some more power out of these big block cars from the early 1970s, it's not going to work as well on the later 1970s cars because the engines were more detuned. But at least for this time frame, it definitely works, and I'll just say that I'll highly recommend it. So what do you think? This is probably GM's most failed innovation. I can't think of another GM innovation that lasted just a year and was on all the cars and then was gone the next year. That's the only one that I can think of. But put a comment in the comment section if you feel like I'm missing one. Of course, maybe one could call this a General Motors invention over here that was failed too. But that's a story for another day. And don't make fun of my Cimarron. I love my Cimarron. You should too. Thanks again for watching. We'll close out now with this ad from 1971 showcasing this particular feature on the 1971 Chevrolets. Let me know what your thoughts are. I think that this, again, is the most failed GM invention of all time, but let me know. Put a comment in the comment section.
With this smoke bomb, I'm going to show you the 71 Impala's new forced air ventilation system at work. It's standard and an exclusive in Chevrolet's field. A ventilation fan goes on automatically when the key is turned. I'll just leave the smoke bomb. The vent fan pulls air in through here and quietly sends it through a vent under the instrument panel. The air sweeps right on through, carrying the smoke out of exhaust vents in the trunk lid. And pretty soon, it's all clear inside, despite closed windows and the car being at a standstill. So, if you have friends who smoke up your car, what you need is a 71 Impala. You've changed. You want more car for your money. Chevrolet's changed and brought you the most Impala ever built. A car that's full of fresh thinking and fresh air.